What it is, people, my name is Batman, and I think Battlefield Hardline is going to be the most fast-paced Battlefield in the history of this series, and I want to talk about why I think this, what evidence there is to support this claim, and why the developers, or more likely the publishers, chose to go this route. So for starters, from the gameplay we have seen, it seems like the graphics and the core gameplay functions are basically the same as Battlefield 4, which is what I think most of us were expecting. However, that being said, I do think the new Battlefield is going to play very differently from Battlefield 4. Specifically, I think it is obvious that the gameplay is designed to keep the player stimulated and in the action as often as possible. Now that is 50% of the formula that has been so successful with Call of Duty. The other 50% is the skill gap. You know, it's hard to say right now what the skill gap will look like in the new Battlefield. We'll see what happens. But that first 50%, which is equally crucial, is a constant stream of action, a consistent source of stimulation, because that's really what we want. Our minds crave occupation. A lack of occupation is what we call boredom. When there is no task upon us nor incident of observation before us, our minds wander, looking for something, anything. And people say this is just the biology of an organism seeking to make itself useful, but I say nay, it is that of an organism too afraid to let go and wander in the depths of its mind, because the unknown terrifies us, and within those endless depths we are confronted with the inevitability of suffering and eventually death. Yes, better to stay distracted, but the best distractions are consistent. Now, Call of Duty brings this consistency with instant respawns and maps that aren't so small you spawn in the action, but small enough to where you always know which direction the action is in, and said action is only a short walk away. Now, obviously, this rule might not apply to some maps in Ghost, but that is by accident, not by design. I assure you that is simply the result of sheer incompetence on the part of IW, and one of the reasons why Ghost failed this year. But one of Battlefield's biggest hindrances in its quest to defeat Call of Duty has always been the walk from point A to point B. So imagine this. You're on Paracel Storm, or one of the Naval Strike maps maybe. It's the start of the match. You try to spawn in on an attack boat, but you're too late. You didn't get the driver's seat. Now, you're not interested in being driven around by some fucking blueberry, because there's a specific flag you want to attack so you can get the chopper that spawns on that flag or whatever. So you exit the boat in hopes of getting your own rib boat or hovercraft or what have you, but oops, you done been fucked, because every vehicle has been acquired and driven off without you. Now, at this point, you, the player, are faced with two options. You can either redeploy or take the 30 to 60 second swim to shore. The swim is boring, plain and simple. Nothing is going on. You are just holding down the move forward button. I like to dive underwater, but the sad truth is there ain't shit worth seeing down there either. The redeploy costs a death, and that's frustrating and seemingly unfair to many players. It's a lose-lose situation, and it's not restricted to the aforementioned spawning without a ride scenario. It happens when you have to abandon your helicopter as it crashes on the combat area border because you took an igla from 500 meters the fuck out. It happens when you're playing Rush and you deploy your home base spawn, but right after you do, your team magically destroys both the enemy's bombs, and then you gotta walk all the way past the first set of bombs onto the next set. It happens in Conquest when you spawn in on this one flag to defend it, but it's behind three flags that your team already owns because the guy snuck back there on a motorcycle or something to pull off a slick little tactic away from the bulk of his opponents, your allies. But then after you kill him and defend that flag, you gotta take a long ass walk past a bunch of empty flags your team already owns to get back into the action. And what's even worse and genuinely frustrating, and I speak from personal experience, is when you travel all that distance, even if you drive a Jeep or something, and then by the time you get to that flag that you thought was hosting the bulk of the fighting, you realize that the fighting has moved right back to the flag you just came from, because with spawning on squad mates and transport helis, the fighting can evolve and travel around the map rapidly and sometimes sporadically, popping up in random places for no apparent reason, and that's just the nature of the beast. And even when the traveling isn't a long, drawn-out walk, even short walks from one flag to the flag closest to it, moments where players aren't enjoying themselves aren't moments you want in the game, no matter how long they last. And again, that's 50% of what is behind COD's success, is that they were able to eliminate those moments from the game entirely. And the reason Ghost has done so poorly this year is because through an incompetent combination of rewarding defensive playstyles, big-ass maps, and a defunct UAV system, Infinity Ward made it difficult to find the action, thus generating extended periods of protracted inactivity, which is precisely the problem that Battlefield has suffered from up to this point, though it hasn't been as game-breaking, mainly because Battlefield has more depth to fall back on, whereas COD is kind of a house of cards, very fragile, and once one pillar goes, they all do. Now, of course, Battlefield's main response to this conundrum, what is meant to alleviate these walks of meh in most scenarios, is the vehicles of Battlefield, all the hovercrafts and motorcycles, the transport heli, obviously. Most Jeeps and the armored car, to a large extent, are all specifically designed to provide easily accessible, high-speed, mobile transport from point A to point B, wherever said points may be. And that's why they're always spawning these vehicles on every flag in Conquest. Because the developers and the publishers are aware that these walks of meh aren't particularly exciting moments in the game. I'm sure they come up in focus group testing all the time, and I'm sure even the developers themselves, when faced with that scenario where they have to either walk for a full couple of minutes back to the action or redeploy, they understand that that is a lose-lose situation. So from a developer's or a publisher's standpoint, you want your customer players to be as happy and stimulated as often as possible. The higher those stats are, the higher sales will be, which of course constitutes the most important stat of all, the only stat that really matters in the eyes of the game's gods and ultimate arbiters. And they really don't want kids having to redeploy and take that death, because nobody likes dying, especially when it's a meaningless death. And what's even worse from a developer standpoint is that usually when somebody dies, at least somebody else had fun killing them, but a redeploy is just a suicide, so it's lose, 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 lose. So in the past, the vehicles of Battlefield have been able to reduce the dullness of traveling long distances, or the frequency of having to travel those long distances. But as Battlefield continues to ramp up its efforts to aggressively peel away sales from Call of Duty, it has to appeal to players of shorter and shorter attention spans, and with much deeper thirsts for stimulation in its consistency. That means reducing the dullness of traveling even further, reducing the protracted periods of inactivity to the lowest point possible. And to do that, there are two big steps they are taking in this new game. The first is grappling hooks and zip lines, which the trailer made a point of mentioning. You can employ at any time, anywhere, and obviously we've seen this already in Titanfall. We know that's exactly what Advanced Warfare is doing as well. It's just the next logical evolutionary step in buffing the mobility gameplay experience, which is something shooters have been trending towards for a while now, because the developers recognize basically what I'm talking about right now, which is that players want constant action, 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 for the same reason that cum shot compilations are so popular. That's why maps like Metro and Locker are so popular, even though half the time it's just a fucking pointless standoff clusterfuck the whole match, you know what I mean? And so generally, the unfavorable periods of inaction come in the form of traveling from point A to point B. You aren't fighting because you are looking for something to fight. And so the developer's strategy across all games this year has been to make in-game mobility more fun and much faster. And zip lines and grappling hooks are the easiest way to do that, short of full-on wall running mobility like you have in Titanfall. Now, the other and more unique big step Battlefield Hardline is taking to accomplish this removal of moments of protracted inactivity traveling from point A to point B is they've put a bunch of really fast, light, mobile vehicles such as sports cars and police cars and whatnot. And then what's really unprecedented is that they've removed tanks from the game, and that's never been done in Battlefield before. But it's a move that makes sense when looked at through the prism of enhancing pacing, because putting mobility vehicles such as the bike or Jeep into the game to alleviate dull, elongated travel times is a strategy that is often derailed by tanks, because so long as tanks remain the dominant force on land, the mobility-specific vehicles are greatly hampered by the simple fact that if a tank notices them, they're probably going to die. Either they, take a tank shell to the face and die immediately, or they live long enough to abandon their disabled vehicle and get gunned down by heavy machine gun fire anyways. And lightly armored vehicles are heavy and light tanks' favorite targets, and I speak from personal experience, and I'm sure many of you can attest to this, because when you kill an armored car or a hovercraft or whatever, you get the satisfying explosion. You get the extra 100 points for the vehicle kill. Oftentimes, you get a double kill out of it, and you don't have to work very hard for it, because it's just 1 or 2 shots and it can't even fight back, as opposed to, you know, fighting another tank, which takes a lot of work to kill. You generally take some damage in the process, a lot of damage, and the guy almost always abandons his tank at the last second, so you don't even get a kill. And just killing regular infantry is fun, but it's not as satisfying as, you know, killing those light armored vehicles, because you get that extra explosion. I know that sounds silly, but you know it's fucking true. That extra explosion makes it feel good. It's like popping a fucking balloon. It's like when the fucking Death Star explodes, you know, it just feels good to see it explode. So tank drivers usually mop up any light armored vehicles they see with glee and quickly, and knowing this, perhaps having been ruthlessly and immediately shit on by tanks in the past, many players feel discouraged from using those light vehicles that are meant to solve the understimulated traveling conundrum, and that's why oftentimes you'll see quads and bikes and hovercraft and even armored cars sitting vacant and unused in their original spawn points throughout the map, because people simply feel too intimidated. Using them is too dangerous or lost cause altogether. And that's not to say that tanks shit on every light vehicle all the time, but enough so that it reduces the effective rate of alleviation of the aforementioned unenthused player migratory issues, motherfucker. And they could have fit tanks into the game if they had wanted to. It's not as if Cops and Robbers excludes tanks, especially when the robbers would really probably be considered in real life domestic terrorists if they were, you know, sort of gallivanting around downtown Los Angeles with fucking armed helicopters and bazookas and shit. You know, case in point, you'll recall when they were conducting the manhunt for the Boston Marathon bomber, they had the city on lockdown and they had light tanks and Amtraks rolling through the streets. You remember that? It was on CNN. I think they were police version light tanks and Amtraks, but they're there, you know. Critics called it an uncomfortable overreaction. Maybe they're right, but regardless, there is precedent to fit those tanks into the story canon if they had wanted to. If there's a will, there's a way, as they say. But there wasn't a will to put tanks in, because ultimately the tanks are counterproductive to the pursuit of a faster-paced match, which is, I believe, the overarching goal the developers had for this game, so that they might continue their efforts to conquer Call of Duty. And let me say right now, I'm not saying this is necessarily, these are bad developments. I know some people have complained, you know, this isn't Battlefield anymore. And there is some truth to that statement. This is, if you compare this to where a Battlefield started with 1942, this is a very different game, but maybe that's not such a bad thing, you know? I mean, you look at Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, I did kind of feel like Battlefield 4 was just a giant expansion pack for Battlefield 3. You know, they changed the color of the text, and Levolution obviously was a big change, and I didn't really mind it that much. But the thing is, people didn't mind, you know, Call of Duty's games early on in its lifespan, even though those games were very similar back then too. So Battlefield, you know, now that it's annual, it's officially annualized, it risks, there's that risk that it could be it could end up falling into the same trap that Call of Duty did with the whole, you know, this is the same game re-released every year, yada yada yada. And I think that this game obviously is very different while retaining the core Battlefield experience. And you know, if you buy a sequel to a game, it's because you do kind of want to play the same game, but you do want there to be new stuff, and I think this Battlefield is doing a good job of bringing new stuff, the theme, the gameplay, all of it. However, let it be known that grappling hooks, and you know, they in the trailer they advertised that the grappling hooks and the zip lines were new. They're not new. They were in previous Battlefields. But they're new, I guess, for like console players. Really, what you have to realize is like probably the vast majority of Battlefield's audience right now is still kind of like new to the series, because it really just started taking off on consoles with Battlefield 3, and now that Battlefield 4 is 60 frames per second on the new gen, it's going to start taking, you know, it's going to be an actual competitor to Call of Duty, whereas in the past it was just kind of hindered. But I've talked about that a lot. Point is, they're doing new stuff. That's important, especially if they're going annual. And obviously, you know, I know some people are upset that it doesn't have that same Battlefield feel, that there aren't tanks, etc., etc. But you know, I'm sure there will be tanks again in Battlefield, probably in the Battlefield after this one, and I'm sure they'll go back to the military at some point. But you know, who knows? I'm just talking out my ass. And please remember to rate this video and tap dad ass, because this is Batman signing out.